Hello everyone, my name is Mavanwi Warwick and I'm EGM for Regulatory Compliance Global and Executive Sponsor for Rule of Law Initiatives at LexisNexis. Most recently, this involved being part of the Expert Reference Group for the Human Rights and Technology Project led by the Human Rights Commission. The final report was tabled in Parliament this year and contained recommendations on how to protect and promote human rights and how responsible innovation methods could be deployed to achieve positive outcomes. You can view the report at tech.humanrights.gov.au. As a quick summary, it looks at how organisations develop and or use technologies, including AI, with a particular focus on recommendations for government decision-making and accessibility. I found the project really fascinating and I'm looking forward to continuing to work with people from different organisations across government, private sector, academia and civil society to come up with some practical ways the recommendations can be implemented. I'm also interested in how the recommendations can apply to different role types, board members, human resources and talent acquisition specialists, product managers and procurement, just to name a few. And then I'm going to attempt to tie all of these multifaceted issues back to what it means for a compliance professional, those responsible in the organisation for ensuring that regulatory and legislative frameworks are documented and actioned with the appropriate controls. For this reason, I'm going to ask each of my guests to provide some practical tips on how to make the recommendations a reality. My working theory on this is that organisations that adhere to human rights frameworks will see positive benefits across a wide range of KPIs, including employee, customer, shareholder and financial outcomes. So I'm delighted today to be joined by Dr. Wayne Hawkins, Director of Inclusion at the Australian Communications Consumer Action Network, or ACAN. Wayne has been living with blindness since 2005 and is therefore professionally and personally well placed to discuss these matters. ACAN works to inform public debate about consumer issues in the communications landscape. One of their most important initiatives is the Accessible Telecommunications Service that provides free and up-to-date information about accessibility features from mainstream and assistive technologies for both people with disabilities and seniors. So welcome, Wayne.
Thanks, Fran.
So, or I should say Dr. Hawkins, and congratulations on your recent PhD. Can we start with a general overview of ACAN, the work that you do and what you're planning for 2022?
Sure. Thanks for the opportunity to do this. I really appreciate it. It's a great initiative and very happy to be able to participate. So just a brief background for ACAN, the Australian Communications Consumer Action Network. We're the peak consumer representative body in the telco sector. We work to ensure that all Australians have available, affordable and accessible communications. And that's across the spectrum of, phones, internet, converged media such as a limited amount of broadcasting services and emerging technologies and digital platforms that we're working in. We do a lot of work obviously with the government in advocating for the best interest of consumers. We work closely with the industry to ensure that policies, products and services meet consumer needs. Consumers, we work closely with both of those sectors, with both government and the industry, and try to work collegiately to make sure that there's good outcomes for consumers in the sector.
That's a really great summary, and I really like the collegiate approach you're taking. So maybe for those of us who are on this journey, like I am, in understanding better what the challenges are, can you outline some of the current challenges facing individuals in terms of accessibility to telecommunications technologies?
Sure. A lot of the work that I do specifically within ACAN is in the area of disability access. We focus a lot on the services such as the National Relay Service, which is a telecommunications service for people who are deaf, hearing impaired or speech impaired. But also more broadly, some of the accessibility issues around inaccessible equipment. A lot of the mainstream technologies available now do have accessibility features that are useful for people with a range of disabilities. unfortunately, it's not always easy for those people who need that information to find it. And that's just going back to the accessible telecom service that you mentioned in the introduction. That's a way for us to provide that information in a one-stop shop for people with disabilities, seniors, carers, their friends and families. It's also, a useful tool for the telecommunications industry to be able to, use it as a way for their front of house staff to understand, what are the actual features in the products and services that they're selling that can be useful for different customers with different needs. I think probably some of the biggest issues around for consumers with accessibility are around that accessible equipment, but there's also issues of affordability, which are not specific, obviously, to people with disability. There's issues of training and digital capacity. Again, not specific to people with disability, but I think for people with disability, those are two really significant barriers for being able to engage in the digital economy.
And yeah, I think that's a really important point, which I know is addressed in the report, because the affordability issue can actually exacerbate the accessibility issue for some people. So the recommendations in the report do look at both of those elements. What was your response to the recommendations in the report? Do you felt they went a good way to addressing the challenges? Is there more that can be done?
Well, there's always more that can be done. As a consumer advocate, I don't think I'm ever going to be satisfied. But I think that the report and the recommendation, I mean, it's fantastic that the Commission was able to do this research investigation and then produce such a comprehensive report on the state of the nation, essentially. And this is so critical. And who knew when they kicked this project off, that COVID was going to come along, and the essential nature of being able to connect and engage online and with digital communications technologies was going to become paramount for everybody. So I think it's a fantastic outcome. There is a number of recommendations that come out of the report, which I think are a really good starting point for us to, as a whole community, like both government, the private sector, and the whole community, to look at and sort of understand, okay, these are sort of the stepping stones that we can take to make improvements.
I love the idea of stepping stones, and I think that's exactly I would like to be in terms of my organisation and meeting these challenges. I think everyone certainly understands the value of things like a human rights by design approach, but maybe would really benefit from either your or ACAN's expertise in understanding the ways they can adopt that kind of approach. Do you have any suggestions on that particular aspect that we could learn from?
I do think that one of the most important aspects is education. And I don't think any organisation has the vision to make their products and services as difficult as possible for people with disability to use. I don't think that's anyone's vision or objective. And I think that, just the awareness that reading the report provides and the recommendations point to are a really good way for people to sort of read it and think about, well, in our organization, in my organization, how does this work? Are there barriers? What are those barriers? So I think the educational part of what comes from the report and the recommendations is really, really critical in our experience.
Yeah, I think you're right and it's also education of different groups of people. So it's obviously important in terms of people who are studying STEM subjects, but it's also important for procurement officers, product managers, and anyone basically who's making a decision or starting to develop technology. One of the other things that I really liked in the report was that sometimes technology can seem overwhelming to people in terms of the dangers that we may all face, including people with disabilities. But I think focusing on the ways technology can actually improve human rights is a really much more useful way to look at it. How have you seen organisations use technology in this way? I mean, you've already focused on COVID, which I think has both positive and negatives for people with disabilities in terms of suddenly everyone needed good online accessibility. Are there other examples where you've seen technology improve human rights for people with disability?
I think, just in the telecommunications sector, one of the things that really was a game changer was with the smartphones, the accessibility features built into smartphones, and that seems to be something that increases as each release comes out. Some of the releases are related to the actual handset and the devices, others to the operating system. But I think that was something that really changed the landscape. I think, when those accessible smartphones came out onto the market, it was essentially the first time many people with disabilities were able to buy a piece of digital communications technology off the shelf and have it work for them right out of the box without having to go through all kinds of hoops to make it accessible and to make it work and to suit their preferences. So I think that was really the game changer. And I think what that's also done by exposing all of us to those features. Some people obviously have more experience with them than others, but just that we're all walking around essentially with a computer in our pocket that can provide access to so many different people's needs, abilities. So you can use it if there's features to change if you have low vision, there's features if you are completely blind, there's features if you have an hearing impairment, if you have dexterity issues, there's features across the board in those devices that we can all essentially carry in our pockets today, that make the world a much easier place for people with disability to engage in.
Yeah, I love that you've stayed away from the analogy about carrying a computer that's more powerful than the rocket that first went to the moon. Everyone loves that analogy. But I think you've touched on something really important about the benefits of organisations who do adopt a human rights by design approach, which is actually that their products can meet the widest possible market, which is surely the aim of most organisations, is to have a wide consumer base, and that also has flow-on effects in terms of costs to develop a product. If you can develop a higher volume, you can charge a lower price, which again might go to the affordability issue, and also to do with repairs. It's much easier to find someone to repair a device that's again been designed for the majority of the population rather than a percentage. So are there other benefits, or can you expand on that particular benefit of organisations adhering to human rights frameworks, whether it's commercial or otherwise?
Well, one of the clear benefits of being accessible with both products and services is meeting the obligations that are spelled out in the Disability Discrimination Act in Australia. So there's a provision, I think it's section 24 of the Disability Discrimination Act, where goods and services that are available to the public need to be accessible. And whilst it's not common for organisations to end up in court over their inaccessibility of their products and services, it's I think perhaps more than a financial penalty, it's that reputational damage that could be associated with having a disability discrimination complaint laid against a business or an organisation because their products and services are not accessible. Definitely, we see that as a sort of a last resort. As I said earlier, I don't think anybody goes out there to make their services difficult to use. I think it's just an educational piece. But I also, when you were just talking about developing from a human rights perspective from the beginning. It's much easier and much more economically efficient to start that process, start a development process from that concept of human rights, rather than develop a product, take it to market, and then have to go back and redo it because the human rights framework wasn't embedded in the design and the development. So I think there's a very strong argument there for human rights by design at the very beginning of the process.
Yeah, I agree. There's been many studies, I think, that show it's not only that legal and reputational damage at the end, but even the cost of retrofitting a product because it didn't adopt that design as a first principle. So I think that's right. And I also like the examples, I think, where there are direct commercial benefits where organisations adhere to, whether we call it ESG or human rights, direct links in terms of shareholder investment. So at the moment, I think it's 78 cents in the dollar on the ASX 200 because investors see companies that report against the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which are themselves based in human rights frameworks. So I think it's avoiding those costs, whether it's retrofitting or reputational damage, but also taking advantage of the revenue that you can attract because that you're doing the right thing, if I can put it that simplistically. So just to end, and it might not be one, but what do you think are some practical ways that organisations can look to implement the recommendations contained in the report?
There's a couple of things. I think one of the recommendations, I think it's recommendation 26, which calls for the Department of Industry or the Digital Transformation Agency to do a review of business compliance with existing human rights instruments and accessibility instruments, which I think would be a very good, would be a really good baseline for us to work from. But I think, we don't need to wait for the government to do that. It's there's ways, just starting, you can do an accessibility review of your own web content and website, which is something that can be done, to relatively inexpensive, and that will tell you, what are there barriers and are there issues with the general population being able to use your online products, your services, and so there's things that any organization can do that can start that process. But then also, just around those ideas of, are your recruitment processes, are they accessible? Is somebody able to apply for a position that they may well be qualified for without barriers to getting through that recruitment process? And in my own experience, that has not always been the case. And generally what happens is, where a lot of the barriers started with employment recruitment agencies, which I would suggest need considerable upskilling and
yes, I think
how people with disability can be gainfully employed, and that from my own experience was a barrier where I couldn't get past it on a couple of occasions. They were unable to see what I was bringing. They were able to see what they considered were the barriers for me being able to work.
Yeah, I think that is something I'd really like to explore, and I believe that ACAN has looked at this, practice what you preach as well. So I think that'd be a really interesting case study to look at what it does mean when you are acquiring amazing talent and how to make sure that that is carried through to your onboarding processes and your retention processes as well, because if you're missing out on part of the population, you're obviously going to miss out on part of the skill sets as well. So again, I think it's like a win-win situation if you can take the time to review your recruitment and talent processes. And I think that's true across a wide range of disabilities, whether it's physical disabilities like deafness and blindness, or whether as we're gaining better understanding of neurodiversity as well. So I'm not sure if that's something you want to comment on at the moment, but I know that ACAN has investigated some of those in their own recruitment processes.
Yeah, we very much try to practice what we preach at ACAN. We've just recently developed our Reconciliation Action Plan. We're in the process of updating our Disability Inclusion Action Plan, our recruitment process. We go out of our way to make sure that people with disability, people with across very much an equal opportunity employer framework, to make sure that whatever barriers might be there, we can acknowledge them and ameliorate those barriers so that people have the opportunity. And it's not it's not proven to be a difficult task. It's just, again, it comes back to that awareness.
Yeah.
If you're employing somebody and they're in a wheelchair, but there's like 3 steps to get into your office, how do you address that? Similarly, with if you have somebody coming who's blind or vision impaired, is there a way for them to know what floor they're on when they step out of the elevator, or is there Braille signage on the elevator so that they can tell that they're at the right floor? So there's not, mostly it's not an expensive or difficult task to become accessible in that context. It is very much about the awareness of looking at it from a holistic point of view, and we had an experience with that. My CEO and I were meeting with a government agency, and to talk about how the government would be better served if it had a procurement policy that addressed accessible ICT, so that they were only buying products and services that were accessible for all Australians, which would ultimately, provide a greater pool of applicants, but also would make sure that, the products and services could be used by everybody. And essentially, we were told that, the government was onto this, and they, in a very nice way, was told to get out of my office and stop wasting our time. But what happened after that was that person took a chair to the copier to see if they could use the office copy machine if they were in a wheelchair. So he took an office chair down, sat it next to the copier, and realized that he couldn't use the copier if he was in a wheelchair. Then he thought, well, if I can't use it in a wheelchair, could I use it if I was blind? And found out that actually he couldn't use it if he was blind either. And it sort of opened the door for, we all think we're doing best, but oftentimes, there's room for improvement. And one of the great outcomes of that is that person turned out to be an accessibility evangelist from that experience. And, a lot of things changed because of that, which was really positive.
That's a fantastic story. I love that, when I was looking for practical steps, I hadn't envisaged taking the chair to the photocopier, but that is a fantastic example of what you're saying, in that, if I can also refer back to my earlier analogy, it's not rocket science here. It is just becoming aware of what challenges might be and whether they actually are addressable in your workplace, because despite the fact that we're moving to a digital economy, I know there are some people like myself who still very much depend on printouts from the photocopier. So definitely should be a hub, as well as things like you've mentioned, like lifts and stairs. So thank you so much, Dr. Hawkins. This has been such an enlightening conversation for me, and I really love the practical tips that you've been able to share. If I can just finish with a bit of a plug for ACAN. We've been talking about how to make yourself aware and what solutions might be out there. Since you are providing free and up-to-date information, I would direct people to your website as a starting point in the telecommunications space as well. Yeah.
So the accessible telecoms is that. It's accessibletelecoms.org.au, and ACAN's website, which has a really broad amount of really useful general consumer information about telecommunications products and services, is ACAN, that's ACCAN.org.au.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. I will end our interview there, but thank you so much for your time and expertise.
Yeah, thank you, my friend. It's been great.